If you like my videos, please like and subscribe. It's the only way, now that the politicians and the media are gone, that we can shine a light on our little community. And visit us on Facebook, East Palestine Off the Rails. Get the truth from people that live here. Thank you so much. I was on my way home from work yesterday, and I stopped in town and I ran into a couple, and we talked for about an hour. And they talked to me about their experience after the derailment. They are very, very close. They're within walking distance of the derailment. When the derailment first happened, they thought possibly the train hit a car, and they got out of their house and they walked to the crash site. And at that time, it was a small fire. And they got really close, but there was a fence surrounding that area. And they said, well, if it's a car that ran into, they were going to maybe try to save somebody or help somebody, but they couldn't exactly get right down to the crash site. But they were very close. Then they started to smell something, and it was so noxious, they had to quickly get out of there. So quickly, they got out of there, and they were so frightened that they went to their kid's house right up the street. And they said, we got to get out of here. That's before knowing anything about what was on that train. And that's before the big fire started. That is how powerful that vinyl chloride smell was. They already told their kids that they had to pack them up and leave. So their kids were having a slumber party. Their daughters were having a slumber party that night. So they had to drive around and drop off all the kids at the various homes. And by that time, as they were leaving, they swung by the accident site, and that was the big line of fire down the tracks that is so famous. Kind of looks like the opening scene. It reminds me of the opening scene of Conan the Barbarian, where they're making the sword, they're forging the sword, and that fire just goes down the sword. So we know initially vinyl chloride was coming off that train. We know that now. Common sense told those parents, as soon as they smelled that, they needed to get out of there, and they needed their kids to get out of there. And they didn't even return on the following Wednesday when the evacuation was lifted. They got out of here Friday night, and they returned the following Sunday. They said in the hotel that they were staying in, by that time on Wednesday, there were a lot of other people staying in that hotel from East Palestine that had been evacuated. And on Wednesday, they went down into the lobby, and they saw a massive line of people, just like a rush, running to get out of the hotel and get back home. But they knew better. They didn't go back Wednesday. They stayed until Sunday. So they were out a full week and 2 days. So we know the brunt of the chemicals were burned off during that time. And don't forget, this reminds me, speaking of this, someone mentioned that, you don't have to worry too much possibly about the chance of our aquifers being contaminated because most of the chemicals were burned off during the fire. What is forgotten is the tens of thousands of gallons of lube oil that allegedly had leaked out of the rail cars before the explosion even happened. What is not talked about that was in the initial press conferences is that there were 5 cars with vinyl chloride. These rail cars carry 35,000 gallons of fluid when they are full. It was reported early on that of those tankers laying on their side derailed, 3 were full and 2 were half empty. I've asked repeatedly and have not gotten an answer whether those 2 half empty cars of vinyl chloride were half empty at the origin, or whether they emptied as they derailed before they were caught on fire. If indeed they were half empty after the derailment, then that is potentially 30,000 gallons of vinyl chloride going into our soil. So Friday night, I'm headed home after work. I stop at the Marathon gas station, which is really close to the tracks. It's about 7:30, and I head home. As we go to bed later that night, we didn't watch any news. We watched a movie, and it was pretty loud because I had the stereo turned up really loud. So if there was a bang or anything from the derailment, we wouldn't have heard it anyway. So as I go to lay down, look on my phone, and there it is. Big fire, train derails. I show my wife, we look at the phones for a bit, she goes back to sleep, I go downstairs to watch the television. I doubt that's where I heard a rumor of vinyl chloride or some kind of chemical. Possibly it was, because I stayed up a little late watching the news. But it could have been the next morning. Next morning I went to work. There were over 300 first responders on the scene that night. Over 70 fire departments. And I want to thank the first responders and everybody. We thank you for saving our town. But Saturday morning, I talked with a first responder and I said, hey, I heard there's rumors of vinyl chloride on the train. And at that time, this was probably around noon on Saturday, he said to me, that is the least of the chemicals you have to worry about. There are a lot of chemicals on that train. You know, it wasn't until Sunday night, after that massive fire, that they revealed that officially there was vinyl chloride on that train. And it wasn't until a week and a half later that we learned about the other chemicals as they were slow rolling them out. First of all, that's a problem. Norfolk Southern has to have a manifest and knows what's on that train. Why in the world would it take so long? But if a first responder knows on Friday night that there is more chemicals on that train that has derailed and is on fire other than vinyl chloride, how is it our town didn't know that? Because we should have been out of here right away. If that older couple that I talked to that went down there and smelled what was vinyl chloride and other chemicals burning, and they, with no knowledge of hazmat, no knowledge of train derailments, and no knowledge of chemicals, just by smelling that, they ran back home, grabbed their children. When I say children, you know, their children are in their 40s. And they grabbed the grandchildren and they left and they evacuated on Friday night. If someone with no experience can see a derailment like that and the chemicals burning and the smell, and they get their family out of here and they evacuate on that night on the spot, I'm just saying we should have been out of here. Because if a first responder knew that those chemicals were on that train on Friday night, others knew as well. I blame Norfolk Southern. I blame the EPA, who admittedly was on scene 2 hours after the derailment. How did they not evacuate people? The controlled release wasn't the only thing that caused smoke around here. There was vinyl chloride burning, among other chemicals. But let's talk about 9/11. Most people don't know anything about the people that got sick. I'm reading from a website, asbestos.com. The collapse of the Twin Towers on September 11th, 2001 released a plume containing 400 tons of pulverized asbestos and other hazardous materials across lower Manhattan. Who is at risk for health effects? According to the World Trade Center Health Program, anyone within a 1.5 mile radius of the World Trade Center was at risk for exposure to asbestos as well as other carcinogens, such as lead, mercury, benzene, and dioxins. A 2011 study involving firefighters exposed to the World Trade Center dust proved this group is 19% more likely to develop cancer than the general population. It's almost 20%. People most at risk: first responders, including firefighters, search and rescue workers. So you know those people weren't there for a super long period of time. Cleanup workers. And then we have the survivors. So the survivors presumably weren't there for a long period of time either. And then you have the residents that live in and around the 1.5 mile radius. So those people are at lower exposure presumably, but living there a longer period of time. This is health effects from exposure to 9/11 dust. The World Trade Center Health Registry tracks the health effects from 9/11 dust. According to the registry, those health effects include respiratory diseases, gastrointestinal conditions, cancer, and psychological disorders. What's interesting is the number one effect And number 2 effect, respiratory disease and gastrointestinal problems, rhinitis that does not go away, and GERD. As far as I know, inflamed sinuses and GERD are not caused by the 0.8% asbestos. Those were caused by all the other chemicals that were in and around that site at the time. I was down by those aerators and I spent 25 minutes so close to them that I was actually getting sprayed by the water. And according to those that disagree with me, they say, oh, those are safe. I can tell they're safe because they're not cyclone fenced off. And they know they're safe because the fact that I mentioned there are no air quality monitors there. They say if they thought they were unsafe, they would put air quality monitor testing units there. Kind of reverse logic. Per my conversation with the EPA on 3/22/23, their main objective with those aerators is to spray the chemicals in the air and vaporize them. The fact that there are no guards keeping children and people away from those things doesn't mean that they're safe. And the fact that they don't put air monitors there at the site where all those aerators are, to me, does not mean that they're safe. In that video, I talk about me having GERD. I had acids coming up into my throat, burning my throat for 2.5 days. So bad that the acids came into my mouth and tongue while I was at work. They burnt my tongue, the inner part of my mouth, and that was after being near those aerators. And it was 24/7. Some people say, yes, I've had that. Maybe after I eat or if I lay down, I'll get some. No, this was constant. It never stopped. I've never had anything like that. The burning of my throat, the burning of my nasal cavity, the burning of my chest, the GERD, the acids shooting into my throat, those were the most common symptoms after 9/11. And there were a lot more chemicals and a lot more carcinogens and impurities in that dust than asbestos. The amount of asbestos in that air was 0.8%. Maybe that's why cancer was not the #1 entity that people suffer from. The most common 9/11 related cancers and conditions include prostate cancer, breast cancer, thyroid cancer, lung cancer, kidney cancer, colon cancer, non-melanoma skin cancer, melanoma, lymphoma, and leukemia. As of 2021, nearly 24,000 people have been diagnosed with a 9/11 related cancer. In all, more than 63,000 people have been diagnosed with a 9/11 health-related condition. I have a close medical doctor friend. We've been friends for 30 years or more, and he's treated some 9/11 first responders. And he told me he had seen some weird skin conditions. Let's talk about the psychological effects. Almost 31% of police officers enrolled in the World Trade Center Health Registry were still experiencing PTSD symptoms 10 to 11 years after the attack. Almost 50% of those officers were struggling with a combination of PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Incidents of binge drinking and alcohol dependence were heightened for the New York City residents diagnosed with PTSD after the attacks. I've been hearing so many stories of the people and the families in our town that have done nothing but fight since this accident has happened. What has happened here? If the accident was negligence, makes me even angrier with Norfolk Southern. But what happened after the accident, the way this has been handled, the negligence, makes me angry at Norfolk Southern, our EPA, our president, Joe Biden. Everyone here should have been evacuated. If someone lower on the totem pole that was at that derailment on that night knew that that was vinyl chloride burning and there were many other deadly chemicals on that train that derailed, we should have been told that night and we should have gotten the hell out of here. Let's move on. Since 9/11, respiratory diseases and cancer have caused the most deaths among first responders over the past 20 years. The toxic cloud of dangerous particles inhaled by so many first responders made their bodies more susceptible to these illnesses. To this date, 1,469 have died from 9/11 related airway and digestive disorders. Wow. So listen, once again, we're not talking about the asbestos. As far as I know, there was no asbestos on this derailment, and that was only 0.8 of what was released during the World Trade Center. What has affected people the most are the things in that cloud that were not asbestos. So cool to have patients that care. I have a patient who has a stack of these over the years. It is the NIOSH Pocket Guide to Chemical Hazards because he works in a hazardous plant. The area that he initially worked for years, he had to get out of there because it gave him too many headaches. And he was put on, I think he works on the loading dock portion now. He doesn't work where they line the cans with whatever they line it with. I know that he has in the past worked a lot with butyl acrylate. And butyl acrylate, he says it's so nasty and so toxic. When they back the tanker back into the factory where he works, he almost put a submarine type hatch that would have a tube on it, and then the tube somehow circulates back up into the tanker, so that in order for the butyl acrylate to come out of the tanker, it has to be vented. So you know when you pour something, let's say out of a jug, if you poke a hole on the other side, it comes out a lot faster than if it were to have no vent hole. So somehow the vapors from the tanker are recirculated. As it's vented, the hose goes back into the tank, and there's never any butyl acrylate vapor or any butyl acrylate allowed to be exposed to the workers. So anyway, he gave me this book, which is really cool. So let's look at acrolein. The reason I want to look at acrolein is because that is what Texas A&M and Carnegie Mellon came in and found in higher levels in certain areas of our town that are considered unhealthy. I can only guess what's being pumped out of those vaporizers, the aerators in our creek where the park is and where children play. I mean, kids might think those are a water park and go play there. Is acrolein coming out of there? Let's look at acrolein's symptoms. Symptoms are irritation of the eyes and the skin and the mucous membranes, decreased pulmonary function, delayed pulmonary edema, and chronic respiratory disease. The target organs are the eyes, the skin, the respiratory system, and the heart.
Acrolein can alter your DNA, release free radicals, interfere with glutathione, and its effects can be felt for up to 18 months in your lungs. It can also make you more susceptible to lung infections. Scientists do not even understand everything about acrolein exposure, but it can cause tearing, irritation to the eyes, lung damage, skin damage, and chemical burns. Acrolein may affect children different than it does adults. They just don't know. Either way, it does cause severe respiratory problems. If acrolein is in the air, it is advised to evacuate the area immediately. Children may be more vulnerable. Acrolein can burn the lips, the mucous membrane, and intestinal tract and cause severe diarrhea. Acrolein can also burn your esophagus and burn your stomach.
So now let's look at butyl acrylate. The symptoms include irritated eyes, skin, upper respiratory symptoms, changes in your skin, and dyspnea, or trouble breathing. The target organs are your eyes, your skin, and your respiratory system. Now that's important because butyl acrylate is the #1 chemical being detected in the air at the crash site currently. As they dig up the crash site, butyl acrylate is being released into the air. People can smell it, and the EPA's detectors detect it. And if you saw my video where I was talking about Ann Vogel mentioning that the crash site is the source of the chemicals and they put more aerators in the park, I can only imagine that theoretically there would be butyl acrylate coming down into the creek and it's being vaporized into the air. And to this day, there are still no air quality monitors right next to those machines where children can play and anybody can walk right by them. So the two chemicals that we know are currently higher than they should be in our air, butyl acrylate and acrolein, those are the chemicals that will cause the upper respiratory symptoms, long-term upper respiratory problems, chronic respiratory disease, digestive tract disease. Sound familiar? But my point is, the vast majority of the people that have died from 9/11 have not died from asbestosis. They have died from respiratory diseases and digestive diseases. Imagine that. Imagine that. Let's talk about the 20-year progression of 9/11 related illnesses. Day 1 through 60, major complaints of ear, nose and throat and respiratory issues begin pouring into area hospitals. Sound familiar? Except we're turned away. We're called lunatics and hypochondriacs. Day 1 through 99, toxic clouds from smoldering jet fuel and building materials settle over New York City. 1 to 6 months, early signs of mental health struggles such as PTSD and anxiety develop. 5 to 9 months, decreased fetal birth weights for babies of pregnant women impacted by 9/11 are linked to PTSD effects. That is very powerful. They're not linking that to the chemicals. They're linking that to PTSD, the low fetal birth weight. An extremely large portion of this town is suffering from PTSD. I made an earlier video about how stress can kill you. It can be damaging to the ones that aren't even born yet. 2 to 8 years later, respiratory issues start to increase. Kind of wishing I never went by those aerators now, especially with the acrolein, taking a long time for lung damage to manifest. And so breathing in potential acrolein and whatever else is being vaporized off of those aerators, probably not a smart thing to do. 2 to 10 years, cancer diagnosis is beginning to rise with cases of skin, prostate, lung, and thyroid cancers. 2 to 10 years plus, drug and alcohol abuse among survivors and first responders grow, complicated by chronic PTSD issues. I see that happening already with our residents. 2 to 16 years plus, rates of cardiovascular disease steadily increase. 11 to 20 plus years, cancer latency. The time between toxic exposure and signs of cancer brings new diagnoses decades after the attacks. Let's talk about the toxic cloud that was over 9/11. The cloud was a blend of soot from fires burning off jet fuel and other chemicals, plus the dust of pulverized building materials such as glass, metal, and asbestos, which had been used extensively as a flame retardant in the North Tower. On September 13th, an Environmental Protection Agency administrator mistakenly claimed there appeared to be no significant levels of asbestos dust in the air in New York City, creating a false sense of safety. Ground Zero smoldering until December 19th, releasing dangerous fumes the entire time. So get this, on September 13th, 2 days after 9/11, an Environmental Protection Agency administrator mistakenly claimed there appeared to be, quote, no significant levels of asbestos dust in the air in New York City, creating a false sense of safety. 7 to 60 days after the attack, immediate effects. Early complaints of ear, nose, and throat irritation, as well as respiratory issues were the most common initial complaints from first responders and survivors. Within 1 month of 9/11, almost 50% of residents surveyed from the area closest to the World Trade Center admitted to having experienced nose, throat, or eye irritation. That is identical to our town. 5 to 9 months after the attack, Pregnant women exposed to the airborne contaminants and trauma of 9/11 were most likely to deliver babies with reduced birth weight and experience shorter gestational periods. This is proven to be consistent with birth outcomes after intensely stressful events such as other terrorist attacks and natural disasters. It's got nothing to do with the asbestos, folks. And I'm saying that because we had no asbestos that I know of on the train. That is from stress. 2 to 8 years after the attacks, respiratory issues continue to increase. Asthma rates steadily increased among those exposed to the toxic cloud around ground zero. Remember now, we were all breathing in a cocktail of toxic fumes from that train. My lower level source that was on that scene tells me that on Friday night, they knew there was vinyl chloride and all kind of other chemicals on that train. Whose responsibility was it to tell us that? And whose responsibility was it to get us out of town? 2 to 8 years after the attacks, respiratory issues continue to increase. Asthma rates increased among those exposed to the toxic cloud around ground zero. 2 to 10 years after the attacks, cancer diagnoses begin. 2 to 10 years plus after the attack, substance and abuse mental health struggles. 2 to 16 years plus after the attacks, higher rates of cardiovascular disease. 11 to 20 years plus after the attacks, cancer cells lying in wait. So let's talk a few minutes about the inept response from the EPA. 9/11 lingering health effects. We're going to go to an article dated Saturday, September 10th, 2016. Former EPA head admits she was wrong to tell New Yorkers post-9/11 air was safe. Christine Todd Whitman, who reassured the public over ground zero air, says, "I'm sorry, we did the very best we could with the knowledge we had." And I don't know what testing they did, but they're not doing all the testing they should be doing here. Christine Todd Whitman, who as head of the EPA under George Bush, told the public that the air around ground zero in New York was safe to breathe, has admitted for the first time she was wrong. Among those who were exposed to toxins released when the World Trade Center collapsed, the toll of illness and death continues to rise. Speaking to The Guardian for a report on the growing health crisis to be published on Sunday, the 15th anniversary of the attacks, this is 15 years after the attack, and they're admitting this. Whitman made an unprecedented apology to those affected, but denied she had ever lied about the quality or known at the time that it was dangerous. Whatever we got wrong, we should acknowledge and people should be helped, she said, and that she still, quote, feels awful about the tragedy and its aftermath. "I'm very sorry people are sick," she said. "I'm very sorry that people are dying, and if the EPA and I had in any way contributed to that, I'm sorry. We did the very best we could at the time with the knowledge we had." She added, "Every time it comes around to the anniversary, I cringe because I know people will bring up my name. They blame me. They say I lied. And the people that died because I lied, they say people have died because I made a mistake." A week after 2 hijacked passenger jets were flown into the towers of the World Trade Center, killing 2,753 people, Whitman issued a statement. It said, "I'm glad to reassure the people of New York that the air is safe to breathe and their water is safe to drink." She always had maintained that as head of the EPA, she was simply passing on what government scientists were telling her, warning those at work at ground zero itself to wear respirators, but dismissing concerns over the surrounding area, which was engulfed in dust and ash. 3 days after the attack, and remember, we were told to come back. See, that was Monday, and we were told to come back Wednesday. So that's 2 days after our second attack. 3 days after the attacks, Whitman told reporters, "The good news continues to be that air samples we have taken all have been at levels that cause us no concern."
I continue to be pleased that there have been no exceedances for residential air quality standards, and outdoor air quality remains normal.
In 2003, the EPA Inspector General criticized
the agency's handling of the crisis, finding that the EPA had no basis for its swift pronouncement about air quality. More than 37,000 people have been declared sick. More than 37,000 people. Many have chronic respiratory illnesses or cancer. More than 1,100 people covered by the WTC-HP have died. Remember now, this is written in 2016. That number includes first responders who are at ground zero and people who lived and around the surrounded area. Whitman said, if people are dying from this, and I've not seen the data, and if they believed everything was fine, then you've got to blame the message they were hearing. And what they were hearing was that the ambient air quality in lower Manhattan at the time was okay. Jerry Nadler, a veteran U.S. congressman whose district covers the World Trade Center site, told The Guardian on Thursday that Whitman had never admitted that she'd been wrong about the air quality. Quote, she knew, or should have known, the air was dangerous, he said. In 2008, Nadler accused Whitman of causing thousands to suffer injury, and in some cases death, due to unnecessary exposure to toxins released by the collapse of the World Trade Center buildings. On Friday, Whitman questioned the level of proof that the air made people sick, but did say, if this is a direct relation, we all screwed up. She thought she was right at the time, she said, but added, I can believe that all the scientists may not have had all the information they needed.
What strikes me as so shocking is if the EPA got it so wrong at the World Trade Center area with so much visible evidence, how can they get it right here with chemicals they cannot even see?
So my advice is for people to live as they want to live and use free will and use their own brain and intelligence. I know what I think, and I'm a nobody. But I'll tell you that at this point, this town is not safe. When I walk by the aerators that are putting chemicals back into our air, and that park is not closed, I think about the inept EPA. When I see no air monitors by those aerators, I think about the inept EPA and the lack of concern from Norfolk Southern. Should the park be closed? I'll take a poll. People are free to do whatever they want. I think people should be able to use the park if they want. But there should be signs warning children and warning adults about the possible dangers. My dad was a builder, and I've learned a lot from him, and I try to do most of the fix-it projects around my house myself. If I change a light fixture, I do one of two things. Either I'll shut off the power at the fuse box, but more commonly, I'll just make sure the light switch is off, and I will tape the light switch so nobody walks in and turns it on while I have my fingers on the wires. If I do not know if the power is off to a light or a plug, a wall plug, I'm not going to mess with it because it's the unknown that will get you. There are so many unknowns in our town right now with the amount of chemicals and the 1.2 million gallon tankers that have come in to hold fluids. I hope that everything turns out absolutely right, but I see a lot of wrongs along the way. It reminds me of that movie, Signs, where in life we're given these little signs, and if we just use common sense and we trust our intuition and our gut, those signs can save our life. Now, different people get different signs. Some people may totally disagree with everything I talk about in this video, and that's more than fine. There is too much division, too much hate. I accept all opinions because I might look back 10 years from now and see that I had overreacted. But can there really be an overreaction when we've experienced one of the worst train derailments and chemical spills and chemical burns in the United States history in a small town?
We were forced to evacuate our home with the threat of charges being filed. We quickly packed what we could and left for family outside of the hazardous zone, leaving behind 26 chickens, 5 ducks, 2 dogs, and a cat. This caused a great deal of stress for my family. Our children had to miss school, preschool, and my wife, who is a traveling hospice nurse, was unable to retrieve her scrubs and necessary items to do her job effectively. On Wednesday, February 8th, we returned home once the evacuation orders were lifted. We went home out of necessity to the home we created out of blood, sweat, tears, and love. I do not have the financial luxury of picking up and moving my family to a safer place. Tomorrow, February 24th, my wife will make me the proud father of 4 beautiful children. I can't help but be terrified of what we will be bringing our newborn son Jackson home to. I fear for the long and short-term effects this disaster may have caused. I, like the others speaking here today, have made countless phone calls, left voicemails, messages with staff members, and have received little to no response. I've been told numerous times that we simply are not a priority to have our air or water tested. I was told by a staff member of my local congressman that the accident happened in Ohio and we're just going to have to wait our turn. I'm sorry, ma'am, but that giant black cloud of smoke over my home paints a different picture. Yes, the accident happened in Ohio, but only a few hundred feet from the Pennsylvania border. There are many families, many of which I call friends from Pennsylvania, that are greatly affected by this disaster. The overall lack of support from our elected officials has been nothing short of pathetic. I was taught in grade school that leaders were elected by the people and work for the people. When are you planning on working for us? My name is Samuel Wenger. I'm a 40-year-old, God-fearing, tax-paying, proudly voting American citizen. I'm a dedicated husband to Joyce, proud father of Bailey, Lucas, Owen, and soon to be Jackson. We have names. We aren't statistics or just plain residents of the state and country. I ask you, how can I assure my wife that Jackson will be safe when we bring him home? How can I assure to Bailey, my daughter, the air outside is safe for her to show me her round off back handspring, back tuck, and to be around to walk her down the aisle one day as my only daughter? How can I assure Lucas that the fish we catch in our pond will be safe to eat? And how can I assure Owen, my fiery 3-year-old redhead, that the grass he so loves to play in is safe to do so? And Jackson, my son, I can absolutely not wait to meet. How can I assure him that mom and dad will be around long enough to see him go through school and not leave this earth prematurely to cancer or some other ailment from this disaster? I ask you, how can I possibly make these assurances? Can you?